When people imagine the medieval age, they picture castles, kings, armor, and wars. But for the vast majority of people, medieval life was defined by something far more basic, far more constant, and far more powerful than politics or battles. Food, or more accurately, the lack of it. Food shortages were not rare disasters in medieval society. They were a normal condition. They shaped how people worked, how they planned, how they obeyed authority, how they feared the future, and how entire systems were built. Hunger was not an emergency. It was a background pressure that never fully disappeared. This video is not about a single famine or a single bad harvest. It is about how repeated shortages quietly structured medieval life itself. How calendars, labor, laws, prices, social order, and even ideas of time and security were shaped by the constant uncertainty of food. Most medieval people did not ask, "What will history remember?" They asked, "Will there be enough grain this year?" And that question determined everything. As we move through this topic, you'll see why medieval society was organized the way it was, why authority functioned as it did, and why progress moved so slowly. Not because people lacked intelligence or effort, but because survival consumed nearly all available attention. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Write it in the comments. Food shortages shaped medieval lives everywhere, and it's interesting to see how far this story travels today. If you enjoy calm, deep history that explains how everyday pressure shaped entire eras, like the video and subscribe. These stories build gradually, and the most important insights come later. Now let's look at how food shortages didn't just affect the medieval age, they defined it. For most people living in the medieval world, food was not a comfort or a cultural pleasure. It was a calculation. Every season, every decision, every hope for the future passed first through a single question. Would there be enough to eat? This question did not appear only during disasters. It existed constantly, shaping behavior even in relatively good years. Medieval society was built not around abundance, but around the management of scarcity. Food shortages were not interruptions to medieval life. They were the structure of it. Agriculture in the medieval period operated at the edge of sufficiency. Harvests were dependent on weather patterns that could not be predicted or controlled. A slightly colder spring, a longer rain, an early frost, or a dry summer could reduce yields dramatically. There were no buffers large enough to absorb repeated failure. Storage existed, but it was limited. Transport was slow and expensive. Most food was consumed close to where it was grown. This meant that local conditions mattered more than distant abundance. Even if grain existed elsewhere, moving it was difficult. Shortage was experienced locally and immediately. Because of this, medieval people lived with constant uncertainty. A successful harvest did not guarantee security. It only postponed risk. Grain stores might last through winter, but spring was always dangerous. The period before the next harvest was a time of anxiety, rationing, and careful planning. Hunger was not sudden. It crept forward gradually. This gradual pressure shaped daily behavior. People ate conservatively even when food was available. Waste was dangerous. Excess consumption today meant vulnerability tomorrow. Diets were monotonous because variety required surplus, and surplus was rare. Most people consumed the same basic foods repeatedly because they were predictable and storable. Predictability mattered more than satisfaction. Food shortages also defined labor patterns. Work was organized around maximizing yield, not comfort. Long hours during planting and harvest were unavoidable. Failure to work at the right moment could mean hunger months later. This created a society intensely focused on timing. Calendars were agricultural before they were administrative. Time itself was measured by food-related tasks. Even non-farm labor was shaped by this reality. Crafts, trade, and services adjusted to agricultural rhythms because food availability governed energy, population health, and economic activity. When food was scarce, everything slowed. Markets shrank. Construction paused. Travel decreased. Life contracted. This contraction was normal. Authority in medieval society cannot be understood without this context. Power rested partly on the ability to manage food. Lords, landholders, and institutions derived influence from controlling land, storage, and distribution. Protection was not abstract. It meant access to food during bad years. Obedience was often exchanged for security. This is why medieval hierarchy was accepted even when it was harsh. People tolerated inequality because survival required structure. A predictable, unequal system was safer than chaos. Food shortages punished disorder brutally. Communities organized themselves to manage risk. Villages shared resources, enforced norms, and monitored behavior because one person's failure could endanger others. Hoarding, theft, or laziness were not moral issues alone. They were survival threats. Social pressure replaced enforcement. Families also functioned as economic units rather than emotional ones. Marriage, inheritance, and household structure were influenced by food availability. Too many mouths could mean starvation. Family size was constrained by capacity, not preference. Children were economic participants early because every contribution mattered. Food shortages defined childhood. They also defined health. Chronic undernourishment weakened bodies even in non-famine years. Illness spread more easily among people already weakened by limited diets. Recovery was slower. Mortality was higher. Life expectancy remained low not because people lacked knowledge, but because food supply was insufficient to support resilience. Resilience requires surplus. Without surplus, societies cannot absorb shock. This lack of surplus also slowed technological change. Innovation requires investment, experimentation, and risk. Medieval communities rarely had the margin to experiment. Failure was too costly. Proven methods were favored over improvement. This conservatism was rational. Progress is expensive when survival is uncertain. Food shortages also shaped law and custom. Regulations governing land use, milling, baking, and markets were strict because small inefficiencies could have large consequences. Price controls, storage rules, and labor obligations were attempts to stabilize access to food, not ideological choices. Even conflict was influenced by scarcity. Warfare disrupted planting and harvest, creating hunger beyond the battlefield. Armies consumed resources quickly. Communities feared war not because of combat, but because it threatened food supply. Negotiation was often preferred to prolonged conflict because hunger affected everyone. Peace was valuable because it preserved agriculture. This does not mean medieval life was constant famine. It means life existed under the shadow of famine. People planned around possibility rather than certainty. This planning shaped culture deeply. Hope was cautious. Celebration followed harvest, not victory. Festivals aligned with food cycles because abundance was temporary. Gratitude was practical, not symbolic. The future was never assumed. This mindset produced endurance rather than optimism. Food shortages also influenced migration. People moved when local systems failed, but movement was risky. Leaving land meant losing access to familiar food networks. Many stayed, even in hardship, because unknown alternatives were more dangerous. Staying was often safer than searching. Urban centers grew slowly because cities depended entirely on surrounding food production. When supply faltered, cities suffered first. Urban life did not escape scarcity. It concentrated it. Markets did not eliminate shortage. They redistributed it. Trade helped during moderate scarcity, but failed during widespread failure. Transport limits meant that local shortage often could not be solved externally. Communities learned to endure rather than rely on rescue. This endurance became cultural. Food shortages shaped medieval thinking about time, authority, and possibility. The future was not imagined as better. It was imagined as uncertain. The goal was not progress, but survival. Survival required discipline. Discipline shaped society. When we look back at the medieval age, we often search for dramatic events to explain its structure. But the most powerful force was repetitive and quiet. Hunger did not announce itself loudly most of the time. It whispered constantly. That whisper shaped how people worked, obeyed, married, feared, and hoped. Food shortages did not merely interrupt medieval life. They defined it. Food shortages did more than shape daily habits in the medieval world. They quietly structured the entire logic of society. Once scarcity became normal rather than exceptional, every institution evolved to manage risk rather than to create opportunity. Medieval systems were not designed to maximize growth or comfort. They were designed to prevent collapse. This distinction matters. A society built around abundance behaves very differently from one built around uncertainty. In medieval Europe, uncertainty was constant. Even in good years, people remembered bad ones. Memory of shortage shaped behavior long after conditions improved. This created a culture that valued caution over ambition. Ambition requires margin. Margin was rare. Because food supply was fragile, medieval society treated stability as a priority above almost everything else. Change was dangerous. Experimentation risked failure. Failure risked hunger. As a result, medieval systems favored continuity. Land was worked in familiar ways. Techniques changed slowly. Social roles remained fixed because predictability reduced risk. Food shortages trained society to resist rapid transformation. This resistance was not ignorance. It was survival logic. One of the most important consequences of chronic scarcity was how it shaped authority. Authority was valued not because it was inspiring, but because it provided structure. Structure reduced uncertainty. People accepted rigid systems because flexible ones produced instability. A rigid system could be planned around. An unpredictable one could not. This is why medieval hierarchy was deeply tied to food management. Those who controlled land controlled grain. Those who controlled grain controlled survival. Power flowed from this relationship. Leadership was justified by the promise of order, not progress. Order meant predictable access to food. Predictable access did not mean equal access. Inequality was normal and accepted because equality was not seen as realistic under scarcity. What mattered was that some structure existed to prevent total breakdown. Food shortages also shaped economic behavior in subtle ways. Medieval economies were not designed to encourage consumption. They were designed to limit it. People saved food rather than money. Grain was wealth. Storage was security. Spending was cautious because future needs were unknown. Markets existed, but they were constrained by supply rather than demand. When food was scarce, prices rose beyond reach. When food was sufficient, prices stabilized, but surplus rarely accumulated enough to transform lifestyles. Economic expansion stalled at subsistence. This also explains why medieval urban life developed slowly. Cities depended entirely on surrounding food production. A city could not grow beyond what its hinterland could support. When harvests were poor, urban populations felt the strain immediately. Urban density amplified scarcity. Cities did not escape food shortages. They concentrated them. This concentration forced urban authorities to regulate food carefully. Rules governing baking, milling, storage, and sale were attempts to prevent panic rather than to optimize trade. Panic disrupted order. Order preserved access. Even rumors of shortage could destabilize communities. Fear traveled faster than grain. People reacted preemptively by hoarding or withdrawing from markets. These reactions worsened conditions. Managing fear became as important as managing supply. This is another reason medieval societies valued routine and ritual. Familiar patterns reassured people. Reassurance reduced panic. Reduced panic preserved distribution. Festivals, markets, and communal activities followed agricultural rhythms because those rhythms were predictable. Predictability calmed communities. Food shortages also shaped moral expectations. Hard work, restraint, and obedience were praised not because they were abstract virtues, but because they supported survival. Excess was criticized because it threatened shared stability. Moral judgment followed material reality. Even hospitality had limits. Generosity was praised in good times, but restricted in bad ones. Communities balanced compassion against risk. Survival demanded difficult choices. These choices were normalized. Another long-term effect of food shortages was how they shaped population growth. Large families increased labor, but also increased risk. Too many dependents could overwhelm resources. Population growth remained slow because food supply could not reliably support rapid increase. This kept medieval populations relatively stable, but vulnerable. When conditions worsened, there was little buffer. Buffers require surplus. Surplus was rare. This lack of buffer explains why even moderate disruptions could have severe consequences. A few poor harvests in sequence strained systems to their limits. Communities did not collapse instantly, but stress accumulated. Stress reshaped behavior. People delayed marriages. Families redistributed members. Communities tightened rules. These adaptations helped, but they also reinforced conservatism. Innovation was postponed. Stability was protected. Food shortages also influenced how time was perceived. The future was not imagined as open-ended. It was imagined as conditional. Plans were tentative. Long-term thinking focused on survival rather than achievement. Achievement assumes continuity. Continuity was never guaranteed. This mindset shaped education and skill transmission. Knowledge was passed down through repetition rather than experimentation. Proven methods were valued. Failure was too costly to tolerate. Caution became cultural. Another important consequence was how food shortages shaped trust. Trust was local rather than abstract. People trusted those they depended on directly for survival: family, neighbors, landholders. Distant systems felt unreliable because they could not deliver food quickly. This strengthened local bonds, but weakened broader integration. Large-scale coordination was difficult because food systems were local. A shortage in one area could not easily be solved by abundance elsewhere. Transport limitations reinforced isolation. Isolation intensified vulnerability. Because of this, medieval people often perceived their world as limited in scope. The horizon of concern was local. Distant events mattered only insofar as they affected food supply. This narrowed worldview was rational under scarcity. Information that did not affect survival was secondary. This also explains why medieval record-keeping focused heavily on land, harvests, and obligations. What was recorded reflects what mattered. Food mattered most. Even when new opportunities emerged, they were evaluated through the lens of food security. A new tool, method, or arrangement was judged by whether it reduced risk. If it did not, it was ignored. Risk reduction guided adoption. Food shortages also shaped conflict avoidance. Disruption to agriculture threatened everyone. Even powerful figures avoided actions that endangered planting or harvest because the consequences were widespread. Stability protected food. Food protected society. This interdependence meant that even harsh systems had built-in limits. Pushing people too far reduced productivity. Reduced productivity reduced food. Reduced food destabilized authority. Authority learned restraint. Restraint was enforced by hunger itself. Perhaps the most important effect of chronic food shortage was psychological. Living with constant uncertainty trained people to expect less. Expectations were calibrated downward. This made endurance possible, but limited aspiration. Aspiration requires confidence. Confidence requires security. Security requires surplus. Without surplus, medieval societies focused inward rather than outward. They refined survival rather than pursuing transformation. This does not mean people lacked imagination. It means imagination was constrained by reality. Reality was shaped by food. When we view the medieval age from a distance, it can seem static or slow. That slowness was not accidental. It was a response to conditions where rapid change increased risk. Food shortages enforced patience. They rewarded caution. They punished excess. They shaped law, authority, economy, family, and thought. They taught people to live within limits rather than to push beyond them. This is why the medieval age cannot be understood without understanding food scarcity. It was not a background problem. It was the organizing pressure of life itself. Every system responded to it. Every habit reflected it. Every decision was filtered through it. Food shortages did not merely challenge medieval society. They structured it from the ground up. And once that structure was in place, it defined how people lived, planned, obeyed, and endured for centuries. Food shortages did not remain confined to kitchens, fields, or markets. Over time, they reshaped how power itself functioned in the medieval world. Authority, law, and obedience were all filtered through the constant awareness that food supply was fragile. Political systems did not exist above hunger. They existed inside it. In a world where food scarcity was normal, power was valued not for its ambition, but for its capacity to prevent disorder. Medieval authority was not designed to inspire loyalty through progress or prosperity. It was designed to enforce stability when resources were thin. This explains why medieval governance often appears rigid, slow, and conservative. These traits were not failures. They were adaptations to scarcity. Food shortages taught rulers a crucial lesson early. Instability spreads faster than hunger itself. When food became uncertain, fear followed immediately. Fear disrupted labor, markets, and compliance. Once fear spread, restoring order became far more difficult than managing the shortage itself. As a result, medieval power focused heavily on controlling behavior, information, and expectations around food. This is why food regulation became a central function of authority. Rules governing milling, baking, storage, pricing, and distribution were not secondary economic measures. They were political tools. Bread weight, grain prices, market days, and storage limits were monitored because they directly affected public confidence. A stable food market signaled order. An unstable one signaled danger. People did not revolt because food was scarce alone. They revolted when scarcity felt unmanaged. This distinction shaped medieval politics profoundly. Rulers learned that they could survive poor harvests if people believed order still existed. But they could not survive panic. Panic undermined obedience. Obedience was the foundation of authority. As a result, medieval governance invested heavily in visible control during times of shortage. Markets were regulated. Movement was restricted. Hoarding was punished. Not because these measures solved scarcity, but because they demonstrated action. Action reassured communities that someone was in control. Control mattered more than solutions. This also explains why medieval authority relied so heavily on tradition and precedent. In times of uncertainty, familiarity calms populations. New policies create anxiety. Old rules reassure. When food was scarce, rulers were more likely to reinforce existing customs than introduce change. Custom became a political asset. Authority presented itself as continuity rather than innovation. Leaders who respected tradition appeared trustworthy. Trust reduced fear. Reduced fear preserved order. This logic extended into taxation and labor obligations. Food shortages made extraction risky. Demanding too much labor or grain during lean periods could push communities into collapse. Collapse reduced future production and undermined authority. Thus, medieval power learned restraint. Restraint was not compassion. It was calculation. Calculating how much pressure a population could endure without breaking became a core skill of governance. Systems evolved to extract just enough to sustain authority while leaving communities barely functional. Barely functional was sufficient. Food shortages also shaped justice. Law enforcement prioritized offenses that threatened food stability. Theft of grain, damage to crops, or interference with transport were punished severely because they endangered collective survival. Other offenses were treated with relative leniency by comparison. The legal system mirrored survival priorities. Even punishment strategies reflected food scarcity. Removing able-bodied workers weakened production. Excessive punishment reduced labor capacity. As a result, penalties often aimed to correct behavior rather than eliminate individuals. Correction preserved productivity. Productivity preserved food supply. Food supply preserved authority. This chain governed decision-making. Food shortages also shaped social discipline. Communities monitored behavior closely during lean periods. Norms tightened. Deviance became more threatening. Conformity increased because deviation endangered shared survival. This made medieval societies appear rigid and intolerant. In reality, rigidity increased as scarcity increased. Scarcity compresses tolerance. Authority reinforced this compression by encouraging surveillance at the local level. Villages enforced norms internally because central enforcement was expensive and slow. This distributed control reduced administrative burden. Distributed control scales better under scarcity. Families, guilds, and villages became enforcement units. They regulated work, consumption, and conduct because collective failure meant collective hunger. This social self-regulation made medieval authority appear omnipresent even when central power was weak. Food shortages amplified hierarchy. Those closer to food sources, landholders, granary controllers, mill operators, held disproportionate influence. Their cooperation was essential. Authority aligned with them because survival depended on their function. This alignment reinforced inequality. Inequality was tolerated because it stabilized food systems. Attempts to equalize access risked disrupting production. Medieval systems favored predictability over fairness. Fairness without food was meaningless. This is why medieval political thought prioritized order above all else. Justice, freedom, and opportunity were secondary to survival. Survival framed every decision. Food shortages also shaped diplomacy and conflict management. Wars disrupted agriculture. Disrupted agriculture caused hunger. Hunger destabilized regions beyond the battlefield. Even powerful rulers hesitated to engage in prolonged conflict because the food consequences were unpredictable. Peace was valued pragmatically, not because war was morally wrong, but because hunger was politically dangerous. This does not mean conflict disappeared. It means conflict was constrained by food logistics. Campaigns were timed around harvests. Armies lived off land, worsening scarcity. These effects limited how long conflict could continue before authority weakened. Food shortages set the boundaries of power. Another important consequence was how scarcity shaped expectations of governance. People did not expect prosperity. They expected prevention of catastrophe. A ruler who avoided famine was successful, even if life remained hard. Avoidance of disaster became the benchmark of leadership. This low expectation threshold stabilized authority. People accepted hardship as normal. They rebelled only when hardship escalated into chaos. Chaos was the true enemy. Food shortages also influenced how medieval societies responded to innovation. Innovations that threatened food stability were resisted. Innovations that reduced risk were adopted cautiously. Caution dominated progress. Progress that increased yield but increased vulnerability was dangerous. Systems favored reliability over efficiency. Redundancy was built into practices because failure had severe consequences. This is why medieval agriculture changed slowly. Stability mattered more than improvement. Food shortages taught societies that fragile gains could be fatal. Thus, political systems mirrored agricultural logic. Incremental change, reliance on precedent, distributed enforcement, and restraint characterized governance. These traits were not accidental. They were survival responses. Food scarcity shaped medieval authority into something fundamentally different from modern governance. Power was not about growth or transformation. It was about preventing breakdown. Preventing breakdown required control, predictability, and patience. These qualities made medieval society durable but static. Static systems endure under scarcity. This endurance explains why medieval structures lasted centuries with relatively little transformation. They were optimized for survival, not evolution. Food shortages trained societies to endure rather than to expand. They taught rulers to manage fear as much as resources. They taught communities to obey systems that preserved stability. They taught individuals to accept limitation as normal. All of this flowed from a simple reality. Food was never guaranteed. When survival is uncertain, everything else becomes secondary. Politics becomes risk management. Authority becomes food security. Order becomes the highest value. And this is why food shortages did not merely influence medieval power. They defined how power worked at every level. Food shortages did not only determine how medieval societies were governed from above. Over time, they reshaped how people thought, planned, and understood their own lives. Scarcity was not just an economic condition. It became a mental framework through which reality was interpreted. When food is never fully secure, the future stops feeling open. It feels conditional. This psychological shift is one of the most important, yet least discussed, effects of medieval food scarcity. People living with chronic uncertainty learned to expect disruption. They did not imagine progress as steady improvement. They imagined survival as something that had to be continually re-earned. Good years were not signs of advancement. They were temporary relief. Relief is not confidence. Confidence requires predictability. Predictability was absent. This mindset shaped decision-making at every level of society. Individuals avoided long-term risks. Communities resisted experimentation. Authorities hesitated to change systems that were functioning, even if poorly. The cost of failure was too high. Hunger punished mistakes harshly. As a result, medieval societies developed a deep preference for the familiar. Familiar methods might be inefficient, but they were known quantities. Unknown alternatives, even if promising, carried unacceptable risk. Risk tolerance was low because consequences were severe. This does not mean medieval people were passive or unintelligent. It means their environment trained them to prioritize endurance over optimization. When survival consumes attention, ambition narrows. Narrow ambition creates stability. Stability prevents collapse. Collapse was always close. Food shortages also reshaped how people understood time. The future was not imagined as something distant and abstract. It was imagined as the next harvest. Beyond that, clarity faded. Planning horizons were short because food security beyond 1 or 2 seasons could not be guaranteed. Short horizons limit transformation. Transformation requires long planning cycles. Without surplus, there is no safe investment in distant outcomes. This is why medieval projects, even large ones, often proceeded slowly. Resources had to be allocated cautiously. Sudden redirection of labor or food threatened survival elsewhere. Every decision had ripple effects. Ripple effects were feared. Fear restrained action. Food scarcity also shaped moral expectations in ways that modern audiences often misunderstand. Virtues such as restraint, obedience, patience, and endurance were praised not because they were abstract ideals, but because they supported survival. Excess, waste, and defiance were condemned because they endangered shared stability. Morality followed material conditions. When scarcity defines life, moral codes reinforce discipline. This discipline was internalized early. Children learned to moderate desire. They learned that consumption had consequences. Hunger taught lessons faster than instruction. These lessons became culture. Culture reinforced scarcity logic even when conditions improved temporarily. Temporary abundance did not erase long-term memory. Memory of hunger persisted across generations. This intergenerational memory is critical. Even people who never personally experienced severe shortage grew up hearing about it. Stories of bad years, failed harvests, and desperate choices circulated constantly. These stories shaped expectations. Expectation influences behavior. Behavior shapes society. Food shortages also shaped social relationships. Trust was built cautiously. Dependence was local. People relied on family and immediate community because distant support was unreliable. This strengthened local bonds, but limited broader integration. Large-scale trust is difficult under scarcity. Scarcity encourages inward focus. This inward focus affected mobility. Movement was dangerous because it disrupted access to known food networks. Even when conditions were bad, staying put was often safer than leaving. This reduced migration but increased vulnerability to local failure. Local failure felt catastrophic. Catastrophe reinforced fear. Fear reinforced conservatism. Food shortages also influenced how medieval people understood authority. Authority was not expected to create opportunity. It was expected to prevent disaster. A ruler who maintained order and avoided famine was successful, even if life remained difficult. This low expectation shaped obedience. People obeyed systems that promised stability, not improvement. Improvement was a luxury. This is why medieval political systems often appear stagnant. They were not designed to innovate. They were designed to survive repeated stress without collapsing. Survival was success. Food scarcity also influenced how conflict was perceived. Violence disrupted production. Disrupted production caused hunger. Hunger threatened everyone. As a result, even aggressive societies understood the cost of prolonged disruption. Conflict was tolerated only within limits. Those limits were set by food. This does not mean medieval life was peaceful. It means violence was constrained by logistics. Food shortages set boundaries that ideology could not ignore. Boundaries shape behavior more reliably than ideals. Food scarcity also affected how people responded to misfortune. Failure was often interpreted as collective rather than individual. When hunger struck, blame was diffused. Many factors could cause shortage. This reduced personal shame but increased collective discipline. Collective discipline preserved survival. Preservation mattered more than justice. This collective framing also reduced resistance. When hardship was seen as shared and inevitable, rebellion felt risky. Risk threatened food security further. Thus, scarcity indirectly stabilized authority. Another subtle effect of food shortages was how they shaped imagination. The future was imagined conservatively. Stories, hopes, and plans emphasized endurance rather than transformation. Dreams were modest because ambition without security was dangerous. Danger discouraged dreaming. This does not mean medieval people lacked imagination. It means imagination was grounded. Fantasies of abundance were fleeting. Reality imposed limits quickly. Limits became internalized. Internalized limits are powerful. They shape behavior even when external conditions change. Food shortages also influenced how medieval societies remembered their past. Memory focused on survival events, bad harvests, near collapse, recovery. These memories reinforced caution. They justified existing systems. They discouraged radical change. Memory became a tool of stability. Stability preserved food systems. Food systems preserved society. This circular logic explains why medieval societies often appear resistant to reform. Reform threatened balance. Balance prevented hunger. Hunger overruled ideology. Even when new techniques or ideas emerged, they were filtered through this logic. Only changes that reduced risk were accepted. Changes that increased output but introduced instability were resisted. Yield mattered less than reliability. Reliability preserved life. This preference shaped medieval development profoundly. It slowed growth, limited expansion, and reinforced hierarchy. But it also prevented frequent total collapse. Total collapse was the ultimate fear. Food shortages taught societies what collapse looked like. They remembered. Because they remembered, they built systems to avoid it. Those systems were harsh, unequal, and rigid, but they worked within the constraints imposed by scarcity. This is why medieval society endured as long as it did. Not because it was efficient, not because it was just, but because it was adapted to a world where food could never be taken for granted. Food shortages shaped medieval psychology, culture, authority, and expectations so deeply that they became invisible. People did not think of hunger as an exception. They thought of it as a possibility always present. This constant possibility narrowed horizons, restrained ambition, and enforced discipline. It made survival the central organizing principle of life. And once survival becomes central, everything else rearranges itself around it. That is the final, quiet truth of the medieval age. Food shortages were not just a problem medieval people faced. They were the lens through which medieval people understood the world. When we strip away romantic images and dramatic moments, what remains at the center of medieval life is not heroism or spectacle, but pressure. Food shortages were not occasional disasters that interrupted history. They were the constant condition under which medieval history unfolded. Hunger shaped how people worked, how they obeyed, how they trusted, and how they imagined the future. It taught societies to value stability over ambition, continuity over change, and endurance over progress. Systems became rigid not because people lacked creativity, but because creativity was dangerous when survival was uncertain. Authority became conservative not because rulers were unimaginative, but because disorder could lead directly to collapse. This is why the medieval age moved slowly. Not because people were incapable of change, but because change carried risks that food systems could not absorb. Survival came first. Everything else adjusted around it. Understanding this changes how we see the medieval world. It was not static by accident. It was restrained by necessity. It was not backward by choice. It was cautious by experience. Hunger taught lessons that no ideology could ignore. Thank you for staying until the end and taking the time to think deeply about how something as basic as food quietly shaped an entire era. If you found this perspective valuable, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments.